that tried to break away back in the 1990s when the Soviet system collapsed. There were two major wars. In the first one, the Russians were soundly and embarrassingly defeated. And in the second one, the Russians were able to split the Chechens into groups and ally with one of the more powerful factions, and in doing so, reassert nominal Russian control. Emphasis on the word nominal. Basically, the Russians provided this one group with troops and equipment and intelligence and money, and combined with the Russian forces, they were able to defeat the others. Part of the terms of the deal was, though, that the Russians pretty much had to leave, and so the Russians still lost control of Chechnya, but at least nominally this faction does adhere to what Putin says he wants to do, even though, for all intents and purposes, this faction is independent. Now, that faction is run by the Kadyrov clan. Kadyrov, the father, was killed in an assassination attempt back in, I want to say, 2000 or 2001. And his son, Ramzan, is, I think the most clinical way I can put it is an absolute fucking psychopath. Tortures people, murders people, runs the place in a reign of terror. Definitely not the kind of guy that you want to meet under any circumstances, or preferably even read about if you have an option. Anyway, Kadyrov the Jr. has become part of the political support system for the entirety of the Putin regime across Russia, where he engages in a lot of intimidation, provides shock troops for, say, things like in Ukraine, and does a considerable amount of wet work, which is, a fancy name for assassinating people that Putin doesn't like. Now, the news that has come out over the last few days is that there's something wrong with Ramzan's health. Now, he has released a video as of the 21st of September showing that he's clearly alive. And so whether there's anything true to the rumors, I have no idea. What I can tell you is that the situation where Kadyrov Jr. Is in league with the Russians is of limited duration and a lot more fragile than people think. Remember, he's basically being paid in men and equipment and intelligence and, of course, cash to be on the Russian side. So if something happens to those flows, his loyalty is, available to the highest bidder. Also, he is the leader of one faction, a powerful faction, yes, but only one in Chechen society. So if you had a change in circumstances, it's easy to see that you can have a power struggle erupt in this area very, 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 very quickly. And who knows how that would shake out. And it's perfectly reasonable to think that this would descend into a bit of a civil war among the Chechens themselves, because there are Chechens in Ukraine fighting against the Putin government and the Chechen shock troops that Kadyrov has brought in. I mean, this is not a unified polity by any stretch of the imagination. So there are kind of four things you have to keep in mind here, that if something were to happen to Kadyrov, that we would see a lot more instability and especially an incapacity for the Russians to maintain the position. The first is that there's no second in charge in Chechnya. It's just Ramzan himself. His sons, the oldest one is 17. They're certainly in no position to take over. And it's not like they were raised in the rebellion. They were all born after the war ended. They have been raised in the lap of luxury. And they have very active Instagram accounts. They're social media stars among Russian nationalists and Chechens. But it's very clear that it's all airbrushed. And these are not people who have actually had to do any real fighting. Could they rise to the occasion if their father was just to disappear? Maybe, but there would be plenty of others who would also try. And that's the whole point. It would end in a struggle. Number two, it's not clear that the group of Chechens that are working for the Russian government are easily replaceable. One of the things we've learned throughout all of the conflicts in Ukraine, with first the Orange Revolution and then the Maidan protests and then the 2014 war in Crimea and now most recently the 2022 war in Ukraine, is that Russian intelligence authorities are not nearly as competent as they used to be. Most of the good ones went off in the 1990s and early 2000s and kind of got into business and got into crime themselves and haven't come home. So Putin is really relying upon Kadyrov's clan to do a lot of the work that used to be done by kind of the dirty hands of some aspects of the intelligence bureaus. And if that were to vanish or, God forbid, turn on Putin, it's not clear that it would go really well. Third, there's more going on with the Chechens who are working for Putin than just the stuff within Russia and Ukraine. The Chechens have their fingers in a number of other frozen conflicts in the region, in the Caucasus, most notably a trio of regions within the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, which has often found itself on the receiving end of Russian violence. There's a Chechen enclave in a place called the Pankizi Gorge that is just north of Tbilisi that kind of is a de facto independent zone. And then there are two zones, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, where the Russians actually have regular troops there, and they're physically maintaining the independence, really occupied nature, under Russian control, from the Georgian authorities. And if the Chechens were to flip and just go neutral in those positions, it's not clear, with the Russians being as distracted as they are by Ukraine, whether or not these areas could continue to be functionally independent. And the Georgians, of course, would love to take those territories back. And then fourth and most importantly, one way or another, we're probably going to see a reckoning here in terms of strategic control. If the Ukrainians are even marginally successful at resisting the Russians, eventually some aspects of this war are going to get to the city of Rostov-on-Don in southwestern Russia. And Rostov is the primary launching point for Russian forces operating in eastern Ukraine, and it is the only launching point for Russian forces operating in the Crimean Peninsula itself. And if it becomes constrained, that is what the Ukrainians need if they're going to ever win this war. But Rostov does more than just serve as a launching point off for Russian operations in Ukraine. It's also the primary launching off point for Russian operations throughout the entire Caucasus, including in Chechnya. So even if Kadyrov remains loyal, any even moderate success by the Ukrainians is going to impinge upon the Russians' ability to influence the Caucasus at all. And then Kadyrov, when it becomes clear that the weapon and the men and the money might not be coming in the same value, he is going to have to make some decisions on his own. And if even as he sticks where he is, other groups throughout the Caucasus, the Azerbaijanis, the Georgians, other Chechen groups, the Dagestanis, it's a long list, are going to start looking at the change in circumstances when the Russians simply can't project power in force to the Caucasus region. And when that happens, the Russians will be dealing with a multi-front series of rebellions and wars that they really have proven they don't have the logistics and the manpower to deal with. So Kadyrov is clearly important, and his health, his survivability, his political standing, where he sides with this faction or that matters greatly. But if you step back and look at where this is going from a big picture point of view, Kim Jong-un on the Korean side, they met in one of the Russian cosmodromes in the Far East, and the primary topic was whether or not the North Koreans can provide the Russians with military assistance, which for anyone who has a sense of history, the irony here is practically bleeding out of the sky. Anyway, the issue, of course, is that the Russian war in Ukraine is not going to spec. And when you have a conscript-heavy force like the Russians do, you try to use standoff weapons that aren't particularly smart in large volumes, specifically artillery. If you exclude either China or the United States from the math, Russia has more artillery than the rest of the planet combined. And best guess is by the end of this year, they'll have gone through over 20 million artillery shells. Artillery shells don't age particularly well, and after they're more than like 10, especially after 20 years old, the explosives start to crystallize a little bit, and that can make things decidedly lively when you try to, move them, especially when you try to launch them. So the Russians have had a lot of accidents with the transport system, their logistical system, and then, of course, they've had a lot of barrels and the artillery just blow up from the inside. All of these are bad things if you're trying to launch a lot of artillery. So they need more shells, and they're turning to North Korea, which I believe has the world's fourth largest stock of artillery. The problem here, of course, is that North Korea's industrial plant isn't exactly great either, and a lot of the North Korean stuff is actually older than the Russian stuff. Gives you an idea of how desperate the Russians are for ammo. Now, the question, of course, is what do the North Koreans get in return? Because the Russians don't have anything from a trade point of view that's of use. You might be able to send a few tankers of crude oil, but the Russians honestly need that for hard currency earnings. So the question is if there's anything else that can be transferred. In terms of military technology, there really isn't. One of the things that the Indians have found out recently, that they've been developing missiles and planes with the Russians where the Indians provide a lot of the capital, and then the Russians provide the technical know-how. And what they've discovered is very few of those contracts are actually being honored by the Russian side because the Russians have lost the technical capacity to manufacture even moderate numbers of planes. So they're now starting to back out of all their contracts because they realize that the Russians have been lying to them the whole time. In addition, there's some talk of maybe a nuclear-powered vessel or submarine, but it's taken the Russians 15 years to build their last nuclear-powered ship, which was an icebreaker. So the argument to be made here is whether or not the Russians even have the capacity to sustain their existing nuclear naval fleet, much less build new ships for themselves, much less have surplus to transfer to North Koreans. And honestly, it's looking pretty poor for that. That doesn't mean the Russians have nothing, and it doesn't mean that it's not a problem. It's just probably not going to be the things that most people are talking about. Look at where the meeting was, the Cosmodrome. This is a facility out in the Far East that the Russians built when they lost control of the Kazakhstan Cosmodrome at the end of the Cold War. And when it comes to launching satellites or intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Russians are still one of the few places in the world where that technology can theoretically be obtained, even if the Russians have lost the capacity to build a lot of new stuff themselves. So the primary global concern, primary regional concern for North Korea is missiles, long-range missiles, and that is something the Russians have in spades. So whether it's officially part of a program to launch a satellite into space, which, whatever, or more likely to deliver a payload to another hemisphere, that is something the Russians can and probably are willing to transfer to the North Koreans because the Russians are no longer party to any meaningful arms control treaties at all, which will generate no end of headache, not just for the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Chinese, who, newsflash, the North Koreans hate the Chinese, but also the United States. There's not a lot the United States can do about this because the North Koreans are not in a position where sanctions work at all. All by itself, this is kind of a big deal. The Ukrainians have been building naval drones of increasing range, explosive power, and sophistication. I'm oversimplifying here, but basically take a motorboat, seal it up on the top, load it with a metric ton of explosives, and just, motor it right into a target. They've been using these for several months to hit military vessels in the vicinity of the port of Sevastopol, which is in occupied Ukraine. And they've been so successful that the Russians have largely evacuated the military vessels from the region completely and moved them back to places like Novorossiysk in Russia proper. The problem that the Russians have, or really any conventional naval force is going to have, is conventional naval forces are designed to strike over the horizon on a ballistic trajectory traditionally, or maybe use cruise missiles. And when you're dealing with something that's so low in the water like a motorboat, the weapons cannot get a negative inclination that's necessary to shoot down at them. So you're limited to using things like RPGs and bazookas and small arms fire in order to target them, and you can't detect them until they're close, and by the time they're close, the main ship weapons are useless. And so the Ukrainians have damaged and destroyed any number of Russian military vessels and forced them to basically abandon their forward military position in naval terms. They then, a couple weeks ago, used a couple of these to target the Kerch Strait Bridge. And remember that the Ukrainians have no access to the Sea of Azov at all. The Russians have conquered all parts of Ukraine that border that. So the Ukrainians have to launch from places like Odessa and sail all the way around the peninsula to do it. So these things already have a decent range. But Novorossiysk is even further away, and the Black Sea is a relatively rough body of water. So in order to strike there, one of two things has to be true. Either number one, the Ukrainians have experienced a quantum leap in terms of range, and pretty much nothing on the entire Russian coast of the Black Sea is safe anymore. Or they are working with a third party in order to deliver these vessels closer to target. Of course, the Russians are going to say that it's the Brits and the Americans, but a far more likely candidate is Turkey. Now, Turkey is the second military power of the region, and historically speaking, they've easily been able to outpunch the Russians on the Black Sea simply because the Russians are spread out among multiple bodies of water, the Pacific, the Arctic, the Baltic, and none of them can reinforce. Whereas the Turks have controlled the straits, they go through Istanbul, specifically the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, they can easily move their forces from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea and back. Now, we've seen the Turks starting to change their strategic policy on this region from thinking of the Russians as a potential asset and a partner to something that they might actually be able to eliminate. The Russians have done so badly for so long in this war that the math in Ankara seems to be that, maybe with a little push from us, we can just break Russian power completely. And if all it costs them is to smuggle a few motorboats basically from here and there in order to destroy the Russian strategic position, it might be worth it. Now, I don't have any specific information indicating that that is actually happening, but the logic holds, and the Turks are in the process of reevaluating everything. But regardless, it doesn't look like there are now any places in the Black Sea where the Russians need to be able to operate, where they can operate safely. That's kind of piece one. Piece two has to do with commercial shipping, because yesterday, the 5th, on Saturday, the Ukrainians hit a tanker called the SIG, which is a Russian flag tanker that makes a run between Novorossiysk again and the Syrian port of Tartus, typically carrying aviation fuel, which is critical for any Russian operations in Syria. Now, it was hit on the way back, so it was empty at the time, and it wasn't sunk, but they did hit the engine room. And if this is the beginning of a trend, we've got a real problem for a lot of people. Let's start with the Russians. The Russian position outside of Russia proper, when you're dealing with operations either in Latin America or Africa, they're dependent on free movement of the seas. And if they can't move men, material, and fuel in and out of the Black Sea, they're kind of hosed. So this is a hit on a very important strategic asset for the Russians. And if this is the beginning of a trend, the entire Russian position globally is going to go up in smoke in a very short period of time because of lack of fuel and the inability to reach people in the first place. The second problem has to do more with civilian shipping, because the Ukrainians now said in the aftermath of hitting the SIG that they are going to treat every ship coming in and out of any Russian port as a potential target, which, you kind of understand where they're coming from, because the Russians have been doing this for Ukrainian ports since the beginning of the war. If the Ukrainians stick to their guns on this, and at the moment no one in the international community outside of the Russians is basically saying anything, then a lot of the Black Sea is going to become a no-go zone for Russian vessels of any type, or any third-party vessels that want to go in and out of Russian ports. And unlike Ukrainian ports, where the world has kind of gotten used to that, this is a shock that we haven't experienced just yet. Now, for those of you who've been following me since the war, especially if you've been bitching at me for getting some of my more specific forecasts on international trade wrong, it's because we haven't had this sort of blow-up yet. My concern early in the war is that we were going to have a short, sharp shock in which Russian and Ukrainian stuff in and out of the Black Sea was simply going to go offline all at once, and that was going to have a catastrophic impact on prices. That hasn't happened, and honestly, I've been very surprised that both Moscow and Kiev have shown a lot of restraint. That now seems to be in the past. The Ukrainians have now already hit a ship. The Russians are specifically threatening anyone who comes in and out of any Ukrainian ports as well, and it's probably going to become a bit of a free-for-all in the not-too-distant future, and the Ukrainians have now demonstrated that they can strike several hundred miles from their ports. That should be enough to reach anywhere in the Black Sea where there is a vessel coming to or from a Russian port. And they have given the world's civilian ships 2 weeks to basically abscond from the region. Now, the way insurance works is, in a normal situation, you pay 1 or 2% the value of your hull every year for an insurance policy. If you sail into a war zone where people are shooting, that goes up by roughly a factor of 100. And if you sail into a war zone where someone is actively targeting civilian vessels, you just can't get a policy at all. So we could see the entire position of maritime shipping globally in this region just kind of evaporate over the course of the month of August. That potentially takes out one of the world's largest oil and ore and grain export facilities, which is Novorossiysk, and a secondary one at Tuapse, which is a little bit further down the Russian coast than the northeast shore of the Black Sea. That can hit any number of things very, very badly. The Russians don't have the ability to redirect this stuff anywhere because their other export points are either already maxed out, places like Primorsk on the Baltic or Nakodka on the Pacific are already operating at maximum capacity. The rail system's already at maximum capacity. And the only other alternative would be to go through Ukraine, and take it to the port of Odessa, which is under embargo. So if this is shut down, it really goes away. Couple complications here. Number one, Russian crude, if it gets locked in, oftentimes in the winter, these wells freeze solid and they would have to be re-drilled. So it's going to be offline for years, maybe decades. Second, not all crude is created equal. And the crude that is exported through Novorossiysk and Tuapse kind of falls into two rough buckets. You have approximately 3 million barrels a day that is exported through these 2 points total. Half of it is Russian crude, which is a medium sour, and half of it is a called CPC blend, which comes from Kazakhstan, specifically the Tengiz superfield on the northeast shore of the Caspian Sea. It goes by pipeline to Novorossiysk. CPC blend is super light and super sweet. Now, the medium sour, if you remove that from the market, the biggest beneficiary is probably going to be Canadian Select, which is a heavy sour blend that comes out of Alberta. And if you remove CPC from the market, the biggest winner is probably going to be U.S. shale crude, which is also super light, super sweet. But in both cases, you've got two big customers. The first is East Asia, primarily China, and there is now no longer anywhere that the Chinese can go to get replacement volumes because the Europeans have already grabbed it all up in the aftermath of the war. The second big customer base is going to be in the Mediterranean basin, where companies in the region have basically sworn off Russian crude and have gone for CPC blend. If CPC becomes unavailable, their only real option is going to be U.S. shale crude. Now, luckily, U.S. shale has been expanding in leaps and bounds over the last several months and years, especially since COVID started to let up. And it's nearing record levels, and it's only going to go up from here. So there's a possibility here that the Western side, the European side of these disruptions, is actually able to replace what they need from North America, whereas the Asian side just gets completely hosed. Which, you want to talk about reordering the international strategic environment. If you take the majority of this 3 million barrels of disruption and lay it on China while the Europeans just kind of, hold their nose and take American crude, that really reorders a lot of things in the international economic system, especially since the Chinese are already experiencing what can be best described as something between an economic slowdown and a sharp break because they're no longer capable of generating their own demand at all. At the same time, they're entering into an ever more bitter trade war with the rest of the world. So, we're looking at the Russians losing their strategic position in the water. At the same time they lose their strategic position in terms of economic penetration, they lose the ability to project power through the wider world, and we get a reordering of international energy, which really hurts the Chinese.
The Ukrainians launched their largest ever drone assault on Russian positions across the length and the breadth of Western Russia. At least a half a dozen different locations, some of which were several hundred miles from the Ukrainian border, doing a moderate amount of damage to a few things and taking out some long-range aircraft, specifically the IL-76 long-range transport aircraft that the Russians used to transport paratroopers. They've been building in terms of their drone attacks, doing more and more further and further. And a couple weeks ago, they took out a couple backfire bombers, which are long-range bombers which launch long-range cruise missiles, which were designed to shoot at American carrier battle groups and military convoys in the North Atlantic. All very long-range aircraft, strategic aircraft. And it occurs to me as I was lying there in bed that we may have hit a turning point in the war, not on the Ukraine front, but on every other front that matters. Let me kind of dial that back and explain what I mean. Russia's not a normal country. It's not a unitary republic like France or a federated country like the United States. Instead, it's a multi-ethnic empire. The Russians have never really had territory that is, from their point of view, secure. So what they do is they expand through the flats of Western Eurasia, absorbing ethnic group after ethnic group until they reach a series of geographic barriers that you can't push through easily, like the Carpathians. So this is one of the reasons why I've always thought that this war in Ukraine was inevitable, because the Russians are trying to rebuild that outer crustal defense that they had during the Cold War. And with their own demographic decline, if they don't do this while they still are able to field a large army, they are looking at collapse over the course of the next 10 to 30 years. This is all about buying time for them. So from a strategic point of view, the war makes sense, a lot of sense. That logic works both ways, however. In order to maintain control of a multi-ethnic empire, you have to have a really deep intelligence system that monitors the population for any sign of dissent, and then you rapidly rush troops to any areas where there is a rebellion in order to quash them. Which means that the Russians don't simply need long-range power projection capability in order to fight NATO or China or Japan or anyone else. They need it simply to hold their country together. And over the course of the last month, especially on the 30th, the Ukrainians have demonstrated that the strategic deployment assets, those IL-76s, those backfires, that the Russians need simply to maintain their national coherence, are now being threatened. So everything that I've said about the Ukraine war to this point, I think, still stands, but we now need to consider that an aspect of the Ukraine war is that Ukraine is demonstrating that Russia proper might not be sustainable even if they win the war in Ukraine. And that is something that has got to have a lot of people in a lot of capitals stroking their chins thoughtfully, because the Ukrainians didn't do this with NATO weaponry. The United States, NATO, everyone else, they're refusing to provide the Ukrainians with weapons that could be used for deep strike capability within Russia because they don't want to risk any sort of nuclear exchange. Ukraine did this by themselves, and Ukraine did not start this war with a drone fleet, much less a long-range one. This is stuff that they built with off-the-shelf commercial components, primarily from China, irony of ironies. And if you can do that by basically shopping at Walmart, then the stability, the very existence of the Russian state is all of a sudden called into very serious question just from an internal coherence point of view. And there's issues about this that carry over outside of the theater of the Ukraine war or Russia, and I'm talking here about China. Because over the course of the last couple of days, there's been a lot of noise out of the American Pentagon, specifically from Admiral Hicks, about something called the Replicator Initiative, which is to take off-the-shelf, inexpensive, commercial-grade drone technology and make literally thousands, if not tens of thousands, of attack drones that can be used to basically sink the entire Chinese Navy. They've seen in Ukraine how effective this strategy can be. Supposedly, they've already built the technical specs for what they want, and they hope to have the entire fleet deployed in under 2 years. Now, a couple things to remember about the Chinese side of things. Yes, the Chinese have a very large Navy in terms of number of ships, about twice the size of the American Navy. Now, the American Navy still outclasses it. We have much larger ships with much larger ranges, and most of them are centered around the aircraft carrier battle groups. China has nothing like that. But the biggest restriction the Chinese face is the ability to operate far from shore. About 90% of their ships can't operate more than 1,000 miles. So you're talking about most of them operating within the first island chain of Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and so on, the East China Seas, the South China Seas. Well, if the United States has these long-range legacy ships that can operate over 1,000 miles from their adversaries and just poke at them, first with fighter craft, then with bombers, and now apparently with drones, then you've basically turned the entire East Asian littoral into a graveyard for the entire Chinese Navy. The biggest problem, as Admiral Hicks pointed out, is that the Chinese have mass, a lot of ships, a lot of people. But if you throw 1,000 drones at it, all of a sudden that's not so much of a problem. And the irony of ironies, the Americans are going to be using off-the-shelf commercially available drone tech for this. Most of that comes from China. So the U.S. military is going to be mass sourcing from China the very systems that are necessary to end China. And the only way that China could stop that is by stopping exporting drone parts, which would mean, destroying a section of their economy right now, which we would probably be fine with if that is the retaliation. The United States gets a lot of crap, sometimes for good reason, for investing in